But Americans have a right to like anything they want and to come to their own conclusions about some foreign conflict or even domestic conflict. Any conclusion they want.
They've been trying to basically get governments to empower a mostly secret group of so-called NGOs that would be financed by the government and who would be telling the social media companies what to take down.
Tucker Carlson and Michael Shellenberger just blasted the loss of free speech in America, and in this video they talk about the unique strategy that the ruling class uses to deprive us of our most basic right to express ourselves. And as far as I see it, these are two of the greatest independent journalists in the country, so let's see what they have to say. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Michael Shellenberger is one of the great reporters in the United States, a friend of ours, and someone who, as a former liberal, has probably thought about speech for more years and with more clarity than probably anyone I know. And so we're so grateful to have him on to assess the state of free speech in the United States 2 weeks after Charlie Kirk's assassination. Mike, thanks very much for coming on. Are you worried?
I'm very worried. I mean, I think what's maybe undersaid recently is that, assassination is the ultimate form of censorship. And it comes from the same place. I think that's what everybody senses about it, is that there had been efforts, to censor, and they had, I think, censored Charlie Kirk, obviously. I mean, the Twitter files, we discovered that he was on a blacklist. There was obviously huge attempts to keep him out of universities. He had already had many death threats, which is not a direct form of government censorship, but these are societal demands that he be silenced. And then at a global institutional level, yeah, it's a very disturbing trend that we're seeing. I mean, I think there's two things happening. There's both a organic kind of demand from powerful people like the kind that you were describing, where a politician just really, I think it was the Moskowitz, where you just kind of can't stand something and they just want to see something taken down. And you see that from groups and politicians. And then there's more of an inorganic demand for censorship, which we've labeled the censorship industrial complex. You can call it the censorship industry. And that is in place in the European Union, in Britain, in Brazil. California would like to have that. Basically, all the Five Eyes countries are pursuing that. And their strategy, I think, is pretty clear at this point, is to encircle the United States and to make our tech platforms censor along the lines that they would like to, so that they can achieve censorship through the back door. And this has always been their strategy because they know that the First Amendment is a major obstacle for them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The new strategy to censor us involves collaborations between big tech firms and the government. That's what the Twitter files showed. And Michael Shellenberger played a big role in exposing that, showing how basically every three-letter agency under the sun colluded with the government, had secret communication channels where the government wasn't just saying, hey, take a look at this. They were using coercion to say, hey, you better take this stuff down. This is a disinformation campaign, and it played into some of the bannings and censorship that we saw there. That's the new scheme. It's to unite the power of the state with power of corporations such that they can say, hey, this is just a private company doing it, when it's nothing of the sort. The same thing was true with the COVID regime and the vaccine mandates, where they said, hey, any company can mandate whatever they want. But no, that's not what happened organically. It was an inorganic propaganda scheme where the government was mandating and coercing these companies to do that.
Since it requires that the people have really radical levels of free speech that no country has ever come close to. And as you said, based on this idea of natural rights that we are granted by our creator, not given to us by the government. The speech comes before the government. The speech is how we constitute our government. Right. Whereas in Europe and everywhere else, the government had gradually let people say certain things. You have to petition the king. Oh, king, can we criticize you for sleeping with Anne Boleyn? And the king would decide whether that would be okay or not. And that's how it would occur. And the creators of this amazing country, and as you work on free speech, I've only worked on it now for really 2.5 years. I'm a newbie to the issue. But one of the things you just really appreciate is really how radical and powerful and strong that commitment to the First Amendment was. It's not just hype. You might just think, is that just patriotic hype from Americans? It's not, when you read the history of free speech over 2,500 years, going back to Socrates, who was put to death for things that he said, also an act of censorship, then you realize just how radical the First and how beautiful the First Amendment is, because the Americans that created our country said we don't want to have a country, we don't want to have a government if we can't have full free speech with some very narrow exceptions.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the case. I've written a biography on Thomas Paine, one of my heroes in terms of his radical thought, and he was sentenced to death in absentia in England for writing The Rights of Man. Why? It's because William the Pitt the Younger enacted the biggest large-scale censorship campaign in European history to that time, and publishers of Paine's great pamphlet, his most famous one, even more famous than Common Sense. If you ask a European, they'll definitely know The Rights of Man in comparison to Common Sense. That was a blockbuster, but it had some contentious things about the evils of the government in England, the English crown. You know, he thought William the Conqueror was a, brutish bastard. He was both of those things, by the way. But this is just one sign to show that, we take it for granted to some extent that we'll always have the right to speak freely, but the government historically has cracked down on that. And we've seen a major large scale effort to do that recently, but just using the tech companies as the tool, as the weapon in the state's repertoire to attack the First Amendment and, outside of constitutional guarantees, our natural right to express ourselves.
And so the exceptions now, they sort of say, well, the internet changed everything. That's what you hear from. That's what I hear from my progressive friends. Heard it on Martha's Vineyard, of all places. It's all changed with the internet. It's too dangerous to allow this high level of free speech. We have to change things. Well, Tucker, to put in context how crazy that is, our Supreme Court has ruled not once but twice that Nazis can march through neighborhoods not only of Jewish Americans but of Holocaust survivors, and that the line where the line that gets crossed between speech and actual violence is when I say, go kill that person there,
Right.
or go light that house on fire. It's when the speech becomes part of the action, or coordinating an assassination or something. Of course, language in that context has to be illegal because it's part of breaking the law. But marching through a neighborhood with the most vile ideology is something that the Supreme Court has twice upheld.
And I'll just say, I don't particularly care in terms of whether it moralizes it, what the Supreme Court says, because it's gotten it so wrong so many times. In this case, I happen to agree with their opinions on these cases. But, they also believe that the president had the unilateral authority to round up people of Japanese ancestry and put them in prison camps and internment camps. That was Kuramatsu versus the United States. Things like that. I would never say these politically corrected lawyers, if they weigh into something, that means that they're right. But in this case, that is true. I'm glad he's bringing that up, and that's exactly right. You're nothing if you only protect the speech that you agree with. It's when you protect speech that others have that you don't agree with that you're bringing about the most conducive society to liberty.
Well, now we're supposed to believe that some racist comments on a Facebook post, or as you said, it's really political. It's really about stifling the conversation around migration, gender, climate. It's actually been less on race, more, a huge amount on trans issues. We just saw a British gentleman, Grant Linham, a famous television comedy writer, get arrested when he landed in Britain for having urged biological women to defend themselves from biological males that come into their bathrooms.
Yeah, this is the most terrifying thing. It's sweeping through Britain, and hopefully that's not a precursor to what we see in the United States, where people literally get indicted, charged, and, sentenced because of free speech that was contentious and, pissed off the wrong people in that respective regime. That's something that we can't tolerate here. Under any government, under any party, it doesn't matter which tribe you belong to, that's a scheme to deprive us of our most basic rights. It is, in many ways, a cornerstone of America, and that has to be resisted at all costs, no matter what. I don't care if you love Trump, hate Trump, love the Democrats, hate the Democrats. Whoever does it, we need to oppose it. And we meaning the friends of liberty, the friends of individual rights that are so much more important than any particular political tribe.
So it is a very serious threat, Tucker. I think that the thing to keep our eye on is they've been trying to basically get governments to empower a mostly secret group of so-called NGOs that would be financed by the government and who would be telling the social media companies what to take down. In some places, they're more subtle with it than in others. That's the big threat. The Trump administration has done some great things to defund that. It was all going to work through NSF, and then Congress would have to bless it, and that was the way that they were going to do it. So the Trump administration has done a great job defunding that, and also holding a strong line on both Europe and Brazil, demanding that free speech protections be there.
But the administration hasn't done a good job when it comes to protecting speech against Israel. In fact, that's deemed hate speech. That's deemed something worthy of trying to kick out legal residents from the country, like Mahmoud Khalil, who dared to object to the Israel First foreign policy regime at Columbia University, and they tried to deport him for that. So this administration, if it's done some good, I'm glad to hear that. I trust Shellenberger on that. But we need to be consistent and say, hey, man, they're talking about policing hate speech. Pam Bondi just did that a few days ago, saying, hey, there's this separate kind of speech outside of free speech called hate speech, and we're going to throw the book at people that violate that. She said that on a major interview. It was indistinguishable from what Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris and Tim Walz were saying about that just 10 months ago.
But obviously, we see some backsliding and some behaviors over the last couple of weeks that were lamentable. Certainly the Attorney General's comments, which she then later kind of went back on and said she didn't mean what she had said. And then obviously, or maybe not obviously, but a dust up over the FCC chair and his comments around Jimmy Kimmel, which I got to say, as the days go by and you look in retrospect, it just seems absurd. I mean, you had Democrats trying to create this elaborate censorship system, and then you had some bad mouthing of Jimmy Kimmel. It wasn't really, it wasn't great. I think it was inappropriate. But I think there was a lot of other complicating factors too, and there was economic concerns around Jimmy Kimmel and just sort of this demand that that he have to be carried on every television station. I think in retrospect, we won't look back on as not a great moment. I don't think the Trump administration covered itself in glory over the last couple of weeks on that. But on the European side of holding strong on free speech and also in standing up to Brazil, I do give the Trump administration credit.
I think that was pretty well put, actually. The whole Jimmy Kimmel thing, I thought it was such bad optics for Republicans, for the FCC to harangue the network, to harangue Disney about Jimmy Kimmel's supposed violations, and despite the fact that his ratings were not doing so hot compared to independent media, which is on the rise in comparison to regime stooges like Jimmy Kimmel, they essentially made him a martyr by making it look like, hey, he's going down in the censorship regime. So in a way, I'm pretty glad that he got restored, because then he can't really serve as much of a martyr. Maybe to some extent they will. They tried to take him down, and I know there were other considerations. His broadcasters didn't want to broadcast some of that stuff. But at the same time, Pam Bondi, I think it was the legitimate thoughts that she had before she tried to walk that back, that is what her actual opinion is. And if the Epstein cover-up wasn't enough, this is a would-be censor. And it's a terrifying prospect for America.
All it did was save Jimmy Kimmel. I mean, Jimmy Kimmel is on his way out. Nobody watches that. It's crap. I mean, it has no effect on American society. It's just masturbatory. It's really, he's playing for an audience of one himself. And this kind of allowed him to pose as a free speech defender. I got to say, the TikTok thing, I think I sort of missed that. I don't know why I wasn't paying attention. I should have been. But TikTok was banned by the Congress, forced to sell. It was a Chinese-owned company. ByteDance owned TikTok. And the argument in the Congress was, well, we can't have foreign ownership of, a critical service like social media in this country. And so it has to be owned at least 51% by Americans. Okay, I don't know why I missed the significance of this. Then it turns out, and they said this openly, it had nothing to do with China. And members of Congress said this. A lot of Republicans. I'm voting to shut down TikTok because people are starting to like Hamas when they watch it. Now, I'm not endorsing Hamas, obviously. I'm not pro-Hamas at all. But Americans have a right to like anything they want and to come to their own conclusions about some foreign conflict or even domestic conflict. Any conclusion they want.
Yeah, that's exactly right, man. That is so well said. That's exactly the ruse that they tried to sell you to ban TikTok. And remember, it was banned for a few days before there was some leniency granted on the part of the president. But now they're selling it to a group that is diehard Zionists, like Larry Ellison, about as diehard of a Zionist that you could possibly be. And I think Andreas and Horowitz and some others that are very hardcore Zionists, right? And that is what they feared. They feared the fact that videos were coming out showing the atrocities in Gaza, showing Israel's atrocities in Gaza that you, the American taxpayer, was funding through your tax money that was stolen from you by a criminal regime through the IRS extortion apparatus. That is what they were showing you through TikTok and opening up American eyes, and that's not what they wanted you to see. So Tucker's exactly right about that dynamic.
Because they're not slaves. So is it okay for the Congress to decide, I don't like the effects, the radicalization of this one social media platform, so I'm going to shut it down? I mean, is that allowed? Can they do that?
Well, this gets to, let me come to it by addressing one of the things that you, I thought, rightly discussed in your monologue, which is this very wonky but important issue of this law called Section 230 and the nature of these platforms that we have. And I think it's helpful to think of these platforms at this point as utilities. They're monopoly utilities.
Right.
You could say there's some competition between Instagram and TikTok and X, and there's truth to that, but there's often situations in monopoly environments where there's some competition, but they really do operate, I think, functionally as monopolies. And
that's exactly right. Same with big pharma like Moderna and Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson are rivals, but hey, those are three of the only companies that the FDA allows to bring certain products to market. So yeah, there's competition in a very constrained, closed market where only a few get the benefits at the expense of all other would-be competition. You're seeing that with big tech too, and certainly how the FCC tries to control the flow of information over big tech.
They're already regulated monopolies by Section 230. They're already saying to them, you're a different category of business. You're not liable if you take down illegal content. You can't be sued for having had that content on your website. It still requires them to take it down. I think my view, and I've published a couple of white papers on it, I've testified on it, hasn't exactly caught fire, my proposal.
I've got a lot of views like that too.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we have to object to the censorship regime, whether it's through the facade of using 230 as an excuse to try to impose a new censorship scheme in the United States, or just opposing the rewrite of hate speech laws, because that's what they're trying to do. Both parties try to do it for their own purposes. The liberal establishment tried to do it to prevent, people from, having criticism against woke ideology, gender ideology, the idea that there's, 52 genders, or, this notion that men can get pregnant. Those were things that, the woke establishment didn't want you to say. And that was harmful or bigoted if you said that. Well, the right uses that too. The right-wing establishment in the United States uses this as a bludgeon against critics of Israel. And we're seeing that time and time again. Thankfully, people like Shellenberger and Tucker Carlson are exposing that. I love how they tied TikTok into this, because that's something that's just been totally ignored on the right for the most part. The fact that that was the real scheme at the heart of banning TikTok and trying to wipe it off the map in terms of the U.S. social media landscape. But you have people like Tucker and Shellenberger, both of which are on the right. Shellenberger more new to that and more of a civil liberties kind of guy that came from the liberal side of the aisle, I guess. It's great to bring this up. And we just live in a world where there's so many interesting possibilities about the independent media and what it's capable of. You see more people influenced by dissident thought than ever before by watching programs like mine, I suppose. But at the same time, the power that big tech holds over it and their propensity to collude with government also presents a really horrific potential future. And that's something that we really, as Americans, have to just object to any type of constraints coerced by the government upon our expression, our right to assemble, our right to worship freely, our right to say what we want. But I do want to hear from you. Let me know down below, is Tucker Carlson and Michael Shellenberger correct about the loss of free speech in America, the strategy they're using to try to force it down our throats? Let me know down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel. Also subscribe to Tucker. Thank you for the great interview with Shellenberger. Both of those two are fantastic as far as I'm concerned. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support my channel. And in return, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live on the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.